大家好，欢迎收看这期的公子视频，我是公子沈。这期节目就像上期一样，跟大家分享两段影片。因为这个频道总是在我个人讲述个人观点，那么我也希望能够跟大家分享其他我比较欣赏的人物他们的看法和观点。那么这一次呢，我选择两位大师，一位是政治学大师，毕业于哈佛大学，师从塞缪尔·亨廷顿。我过去在公子阅读的栏目也解读过亨廷顿的经典著作，比如最经典的《文明冲突论》。那作为亨廷顿的高徒弗朗西斯·福山，他的名字跟他的老师一样知名，也算是在学术圈如雷贯耳了。因为他曾经提出历史的终结，就是他讲到历史上的意识形态之争已经终结，自由民主和资本主义取得了最后的胜利。当然他的观点也有很多人反对但是至少已经让他成为这个学界最知名的人物了。那后来他也写了很多的著作，也都非常的出色，像政治秩序的起源、政治秩序与政治衰败等等等等，可以说是继承了他老师亨廷顿的衣钵。虽然他的理论更像是对他老师的一些的修订和补充，但是我给大家分享这段影片呢，是10年前他对中国和俄罗斯的预测，而且都被他说准了。他在这次康奈尔大学的演讲当中提到，俄罗斯的普京开启了一个不好的先例，就是拿下了克米里亚，那么未来他将会继续的侵占更多的领土。然后他也提到了习近平的上台，那个时候刚刚成为国家最高领导人不久。他也提到了他有一种感觉，习近平有可能要成为第二个毛泽东，中国人未来可能有大麻烦了。我们看看政治学大师福山在10年前的准确预测。
It's a heavily oil-dependent economy, and I also think that the course that President Putin has set this year after the annexation of Crimea makes it a very difficult model to sustain, because I think it's going to be inevitably based on external expansion, the reunification of Russians outside of Russia. And we've had experience with that kind of regime before in the 20th century, that you do it to gain domestic support, but internationally it gets you embroiled with all of your neighbors, and for that reason I think it's not a terribly sustainable model. The most serious alternative is really China. China is heir to a very long-standing civilization. I argued in the first volume in The Origins of Political Order that China not only developed a state early on, it developed a modern state, modern in Max Weber's sense of bureaucratic, rational, impersonal. And they did this really in the 3rd century BC. And in fact, the present Chinese government is an heir to that extremely long Confucian tradition. And part of the reason that they've been able to modernize as rapidly as they have after 1978 is that they can call on that wellspring of a very, very deep tradition of a bureaucratic state, and they do it better than any other society in the world. If you look at what makes for a high-quality Chinese authoritarianism, I think I would point to several things. So, for example, they are rule-bound to an increasing extent. One of the big weaknesses of authoritarian regimes in other parts of the world, like the Middle East or in Africa, is that authoritarian rulers don't know when to step down. If Gaddafi or Mubarak had left power after 10 years, I think they would actually be probably pretty positively remembered by their peoples, but instead they stayed in one case over 40 years, and another case for about 35, way past the point where they were actually contributing to the health of their societies. In China, one of the interesting things about governance there is since 1978, you've had this steady spread of rules, not the rule of law. The rule of law is really a firm constitutional limitation in the power of the most powerful in the society, but there is a spread of rules, including rules for leadership turnover. And so we've now had 3 of these 10-year cycles of term limits, and you have mandatory retirements and things of that sort. Another thing they do well is actually state autonomy. There is actually an advantage to being an authoritarian government when you're trying to do important kinds of reforms. If you think about the reforms that Deng Xiaoping accomplished after 1978 in decollectivizing agriculture, creating a market economy, shifting that entire society into a very different form of economic production, you couldn't possibly have done this in a democracy. Not with all of the interest groups and legal restrictions and constraints on power that exist in a modern liberal democracy, but you can do it in a dictatorship because the state is not constrained by either a firm rule of law or by normal democratic politics. And it means that if you want to undertake positive reforms, you can do it much faster and more effectively. So they put up a high-speed rail system costing, something like $400 billion, and they do it in 5 years. And, I live in California, and we're still putzing around, trying to put up a high-speed rail system between Los Angeles and San Francisco, and I'm not counting on it to emerge any time in my lifetime, I guarantee you. And finally, I would say the other thing about the Chinese system that is really important to understand is a moral characteristic. I think one of the deepest legacies of Confucianism is a belief on the part of ruling elites that they have an obligation to something that is enriching themselves and their families. If you look around the world at where developmental states have all been located, the vast majority of them are in East Asia, in parts of the world that are under this broad Chinese Confucian cultural domain, because in Confucianism you have a long tradition of training princes to rule justly in the interest of the broader community. And that's why in East Asia it's been possible, and Peter, among others, has written about this. I mean, this is one of the reasons that they can do things like run an industrial policy, which in Latin America or in Africa or in South Asia gets incredibly corrupted, but in East Asia has actually been turned towards high-speed development. And I think that Communist Party is very corrupt in many, many ways, but there has still been a developmental focus that they have managed to maintain that is extremely difficult for other authoritarian countries to achieve. So that's the good part. What's the bad part? And I think, in fact, the bad parts of the Chinese system are all the counterparts of the things that I just mentioned as being advantages, beginning with the moral one, which is that although they are the heirs of this Confucian tradition, they're really confused about this, because the other half of it is Marxist-Leninist, and they can't either genuinely revive that indigenous Chinese tradition or make a break from Marxism-Leninism. And what fills the gap morally for many Chinese is just plain naked self-interest. And it's, I think, hard to run a country for a long period on that basis. The economic model, I mean, this is a more technical issue, but I think has got some real problems. Most unsolvable political problem they've got is what in Chinese, traditional Chinese historiography is called the problem of the bad emperor. So if you have a good emperor, like Deng Xiaoping, because you don't have constraints, you don't have formal checks and balances in the system, you can do a lot of good very, very rapidly. But the same absence of checks and balances means that if you get a bad emperor, you're in big trouble. And most Chinese, I think, would say that they had a pretty bad emperor recently in the form of Mao Zedong, who could, do and undertake policies leading to the deaths of tens of millions of people because there were no checks on his power in the system. And right now, what you're seeing unfold in China is perhaps another version of that. So Xi Jinping, the new Chinese leader, has been accumulating power on an unprecedented scale in a way that is bursting apart the kind of understanding of collective leadership that emerged since 1978. He bids fair to be the most powerful Chinese ruler since Deng and possibly even since Mao. And this is where I think you have the real vulnerability of that system. We do not know at this point whether he is a good or a bad emperor. We just don't know. You can construct a positive scenario where he's going to liberalize the economy, he's going to break the power of the state-owned enterprises, he's eventually going to open up the Chinese system, or he could just be one of the worst dictators in recent Chinese memory and undo a lot of the rule-bound decision-making that China, that has set China apart as an authoritarian country. We don't know, and if it's the wrong form of emperor, the Chinese are in big trouble, as well as probably a lot of its neighbors.
福山解读了 中国为什么过去取得了成就，它内部有哪些机制和传统有利于它承载了西方所带来的这些外包的制造业技术、资金、人才搭上了这个资本主义全球化的顺风车，它有哪些内在的条件？我认为这些条件都是存在的，包括它所谓的官吏的制度士大夫精神等等等等，这是所谓的吏治传统，也有很多的其他的专家也都讲过。但是更重要的，他提到的，你没有自由，没有民主，没有法治，什么结果？就是你要依靠一个好皇上，你要依靠一个正确的方向，你这个方向走对了就没问题，你方向走错了就万劫不复。我上期节目刚刚讲到新加坡，就是新加坡有了一个英明的领导，虽然他有某种程度的一党专政的这种独裁倾向，也被人诟病，但是他选对了路线，就带来新加坡的繁荣和稳定。虽然现在也有很多新加坡人在争取更大的政治权利，可是相对来说，对新加坡人整体利益来讲，大家愿意选择人民行动党。可是对中国来讲，过去邓小平的改革开放是正确的路线，解放了生产力，也解放了很多个人的权利。所以说6·4的屠杀，大家甚至可能某种程度的原谅他，至少让大多数中国人不再经历毛泽东的那个恐怖统治了。可是他的权力仍然是没有 check and balance， 没有任何制衡，所以导致现在的结果就是习近平上台之后，过去这10年不断的加强自身的权力，把所有权力集中在党中央，党中央的权力集中在自己身上。当他定于一尊的时候，那么我们就期待着说他的路线是正确的，可是他的定于一尊本身和中国应该走的正确路线正好相反，所以导致的结果就是他的集权和他现在的闭关锁国、战狼外交、赶走外资、强化国企这些种种的做法，当然就是在走回头路。而走回头路当然会使得好不容易过去改革开放40年取得一定成就的，开始拥抱世界的这些中国人一巴掌打回原形，未来肯定一步一步的走向倒退。其实现在我们已经正在见证这个历史了，福山在10年前的预言成真了。那么另外我想跟大家分享的影片呢，是还没有成真的预言。这个影片是英国著名历史学家尼尔·弗格森接受美国保守派媒体人夏皮罗的专访，他们专门提到中国和台湾问题。弗格森在历史学界的地位就像是福山在政治学界的地位，他出版了很多本著作，几乎本本是全球畅销的，像《帝国》、《文明》、《货币崛起》，以及一些传记，比如基辛格的传记基辛格的传记，还有罗斯柴尔德家族的传记。他毕业于牛津大学，现在在美国哈佛大学任教。他的研究专长是世界史、经济史、帝国主义和殖民史。他在2004年被《时代周刊》誉为全球100大最有影响力的人。这个访问是在2年前进行的，当时我就看到这个影片了，本来是想分享给大家，当时后来干别的事儿就忘了。他的2年前的这个警告到今天仍然成立。我们一起来看一下。
China is clearly past its peak. The growth rate is going to come down pretty rapidly, not just because of demographics, but because of the debt burdens that have been accumulated. I mean, if 29% of economic activity is real estate, your business model is essentially tower blocks for nobody, as opposed to bridges to nowhere. And although I don't think there'll be some epic financial crisis a la Lehman Brothers, because that much the Chinese leadership know to avoid, I still think they're on a path to being Japan, but at a lower per capita income level. But that's just why the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is more likely to take strategic risk in the short run, because Xi Jinping knows that he is in a dangerously Gorbachev-like situation. He knows that it's got harder and harder to reform the Chinese economy, just as it was impossible to reform the Soviet economy by the 1980s. Now it's impossible to reform the Chinese economy. Too many vested interests, parties too much involved. It's actually an unfixable system. I mean, our system has all kinds of problems, but it's quite fixable. We have the self-repair function, and I don't think they do. So it's clear that Xi is going to base the legitimacy of the party more and more on nationalism, because that's all they've got. And that seems to me to point in the direction of a showdown over Taiwan. Not this year. This year they're going to be kind of busy teeing up his third term as leader for life. But the Taiwan issue is going to be the issue, I would say, of 2023. And that's a semiconductor story. I mean, Taiwan is TSMC HQ. TSMC is the cutting edge company for semiconductors. Most of their capacity is still there. So in Cold War II, which I think we're in, it's sort of Cuba meets the Persian Gulf meets Berlin. And that is troubling to me because ultimately, after pandemics, wars are the thing that really kill a lot of people prematurely, historically. And we haven't had a really big war for a while. Now, you could be Steve Pinker and say, there isn't going to be another big war because trends, but then Steve Pinker said that about pandemics in Enlightenment Now and took the bet with Martin Rees that there wouldn't be one. So I'm not inclined to take that bet that there'll never be another really big war. In fact, I think we're much closer to another really big war than most civilians want to face because we got used to small wars. Afghanistan and Iraq were small wars in terms of the numbers of people who fought them and the numbers of people who died in them and even the amount they cost, that they were pretty expensive. But a war over Taiwan would be a whole different deal.
Well, do you think that the West would even do anything over Taiwan? I mean, the West did nothing over Hong Kong, obviously, and they violated every treaty guarantee they'd ever made to the British government, and nobody batted an eye when they just took Hong Kong and ingested it completely and imprisoned all of the dissidents. So I wonder whether, I mean, I think that is what raises the risk of a greater war, is because eventually, I keep saying this on my show, but I feel like when it comes to foreign policy, everybody on the other side is Hans Gruber from Die Hard, and they're sitting there going, eventually I'm going to get to somebody you do care about. We keep saying, okay, so we don't care about Ukraine. You know, take some Ukraine, no big deal. Take some of Hong Kong, take Taiwan. But eventually, it'll be China threatening Australia, and then it'll be like, okay, well, are we willing to sit by while China is cutting off the shipping lanes around Australia? I mean, it seems like they have no real incentive not to do that because they have to keep ingesting territory and they have to keep ingesting resources because their economy is a failure.
I think the scenario that's most likely is not so much one based on resources. I think it's more that the legitimacy of Xi Jinping as leader depends on resolving, quote unquote, the Taiwanese anomaly. And it is an anomaly. It's not like Hong Kong, remember, because Taiwan is in this ambiguous situation in which we pretend, and this has been true since the time of Kissinger, we kind of pretend that it's okay for them to say that it's part of China, but in practice it's an autonomous democracy, and we have, since the legislation of 1979, a commitment to keep it that way and not to accept any change in its status that is forcible. So I think it's very, very different indeed. It's hard for me to imagine that any administration could simply acquiesce if the Chinese decided to invade Taiwan. And if an administration did acquiesce in such a takeover, that would be it. That would be game over for American primacy in the Indo-Pacific region, and I think pretty much everywhere else too. So I think it's not Hong Kong. I think it's problematic because, and this reminds me of other major geopolitical crises, we have on the one hand a commitment, but on the other hand, a diminishing credibility of that commitment. I don't think the US can at this moment really deter China from taking that military risk if it wanted to, because we no longer have the dominance, particularly in naval terms, that we had, say, in the 1990s. So Taiwan Strait crisis is a nightmare for the Pentagon because they know that it'd be extremely difficult for us to do anything about it. They know that the Taiwanese, with their own resources, wouldn't be able to do much about it. So we are in this very, very dangerous moment where you can see how the incentive is growing for Xi to do this. We know that he regards it as the capstone of his entire career, the thing that gets him into Mao Zedong territory in terms of his historical significance. We know that it's his ultimate goal. He said that. But we also know that the time frame within which he can achieve it is finite. Because if we really decide to beef up Taiwan's deterrence, if we're serious about things like the Quad with Japan, Australia, and India, if we're serious about AUKUS with the Australians and the Brits, then his room to do this is not limitless. And that's the kind of thing that leads to conflicts historically.
其实对于习近平来讲，他做什么事情我们是控制不了的。他为了实现他的伟大理想，成为毛泽东第二，或者是为了加强自己的统治和自己在历史中的地位，他可能去贸然的做一些事情，而且目前看起来已经没有任何的党内的阻碍了，他的权势已经定于一尊。 在这种情况下，那么西方国家或者是作为外界来讲的话，能做的事情不是改变习近平，而是对习近平进行极限施压，让他意识到发动战争的代价太大，大到他没有办法实现他的理想，或者巩固自己的权利，甚至还可能导致他的灭亡。如果是这样的话，那可能能够不会发生战争。就算他发生战争，至少我们也有准备了。所以我认为从他这个警告当中，我们能够学到的就是全世界应该认真对待今天对中国的制裁和围堵的印太战略，并且全力以赴加强印太战略对中国的威慑，这是我们唯一能做的事情。因为当你不知道对方会怎么做的时候，你只能做最坏的打算。而如果像某些像台湾的蓝营的一些人物，他们想着说可以下跪祈求表示友好就能够避免战争的话，那么就太过于天真以及不负责任了。因为一旦他们的妥协和忍让没有起到作用，反而可能会导致在战争当中处于下风，甚至还没有开战你就自己投降了，对方实现了不战而屈人之兵，这将把整个台湾推向万劫不复的深渊。又像我说的，如果台湾成为中国的一部分，中国的实力大增，那未来跟美国决一雌雄的时候，台湾就是中国的炮灰。所以你希望是今天和中国对抗，还是未来被美国轰炸呢？换句话说，你想现在自己承担责任，去勇敢的面对现实，而且还有不只是一线生机而且有很大的机会能够获胜，还是说我自己选择苟且偷生，最终危害自己的子孙后代？好，感谢收看这期的公子视频，欢迎大家点击订阅这个频道，别忘了点赞、评论、转发，我们下期节目再见。